Okay, great. Well, it looks like we are live here for this eco webinar in partnership with Fuller Youth Institute and Sticky Faith. I'm so grateful to be having this with you, Kara. I've just had a great pleasure in getting to know you more in the last year when you were doing your PhD the same time I was doing my MDiv at Fuller.
Right.
And so many of my friends were taking in the student ministry track and just spoke wonderful things about you and your ministry. And I never knew you back then, but then also hearing from them, but then also so many of our churches have been part of the Sticky Faith initiative and institute. So thankful for your ministry with us and with students and helping to have a great impact of faith. And wanting to welcome all of you who are watching this webinar so that you know there'll be an opportunity for you in the last 15 minutes or so to be able to have asked questions of Kara. You can email those to Brian Nelson, and his email is bnelson, Nelson, @fuller.edu. So if you want to write that down, again, bnelson@fuller.edu. You can email questions throughout this and he'll pass them off to Kara and we'll do those at the end. So, well, welcome, Kara. And if you just want to say a little bit about yourself and your role, and we'll jump into this.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And Dana, it's just such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you and so many amazing leaders today. We at Fuller, we are big fans of what God is doing in and through ECO. And so just a chance to partner with you and dream about how God wants to work even more deeply in the lives of young people and families and congregations. It's a thrill. So I'm looking forward to a great conversation this hour. I'm a faculty member at Fuller Seminary, but really my main job is I work with the team here at the Fuller Youth Institute. And our mission is to equip young people with the lifelong faith that they need. And we do that by taking the best research that Fuller and others are doing and turning it into practical resources. So one way I think about our role is that we take PhD level ideas and translate it into USA Today level tools for any adult, parent, grandparent, leader who wants to see the gospel make a bigger difference in the lives of young people. I'm also a mom. I have 3 kids, one who just started high school 2 months ago, and then our second just turned 13 on Sunday. So Dave and I are now officially parenting 2 teenagers, and then we have a 9-year-old who's in 4th grade. And I gotta say that what we're talking about with Sticky Faith, it's changed my parenting. The way that I interacted with my 13-year-old on the drive home from the orthodontist appointment this morning was different because of our research. So I look forward to thinking about how our research makes a difference in churches as well as in families.
That's wonderful. Well, I know we've read your book in our family, and it's begun to shape how we do parenting. So thank you for that. Made a good impact.
Yeah. Right. Thank you, Dana. Now, are you in your office, Dana?
I am. Yes.
Nice. I can't help but notice I have a lot more books than you.
Well, I also have a home office, and you're not seeing about a quarter of things.
Got it. No, I said I have more books. I didn't say I've read more books.
Right.
But I do. This is like this wall of books. It's a little intimidating. We should come up with a warmer backdrop. But anyway, but thanks for your kind words, and glad that Sticky Faith is helping you and your wife as you think about parenting too. Remind me, how old are your kids?
They are 11 and 9 are boys, and then a 7-year-old girl. So it's a sweet time. It's a sweet time.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, well, I know you said that what Sticky Faith does is take kind of the PhD level research and make it applicable. So this all started from a research project. Tell us a little bit about that project and what came out of it, why you started it.
Absolutely. It actually was because of a PCUSA student here at Fuller, a master's degree student, who saw what was happening to the youth group graduates in her church. And she thought, so many of them are drifting from the faith. And so she went and talked to a faculty member and said, I'd like to study this more in depth. And that faculty member walked with her over to our offices and said, this is kind of an interesting idea, looking at what happens to youth group graduates after they graduate. And so from that conversation with that master's level student, we received a number of grants that allowed us to study over 500 young people during their first 3 years in college. I used to say through their junior year in college, but junior year and first 3 years, not always the same thing.
Right.
So through their first 3 years in college, and we've also studied 50 families that are particularly effective at building long-term faith. Plus, we've had about 150 churches, including many eco churches, go through our Sticky Faith cohort. So we've had the chance to walk with young people themselves, interview families, and then track with churches. And the reason that we wanted to do all this research is because other studies indicate that about half of youth group graduates drift from God and the church after they graduate from high school, somewhere between 40 and 50%. So, all of us who are watching this, as we think about the young people that we care about so much, and imagine taking a picture of them in our minds, and then imagine getting a red pen and putting an X across 50% of their faces. Tragically, that many young people drift from God and the church. And so that was so disheartening to us, alarming to us, that's why we thought we want to study young people, churches, and families. And we've been able to receive funding and work with amazing faculty and leaders like those on this webinar in order to do all of this research. So, I mean, we only have an hour today where we're going to try to summarize really 6 hours of research. And that's why we're encouraging folks to email their questions to Brian Nelson. And his email is bnelson@fuller.edu. We want this to be as interactive as possible. And so please let us know what questions still remain as we're talking about our data, as well as what new questions our data sparks in you. We want to get to as many of those questions as we possibly can toward the end of our hour together.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'd remind our audience that you'll be one of our keynote speakers at our national gathering. And
yeah, in January. Really looking forward to it.
We're really looking forward to that because, we want to have people that are going to help speak into places that we're not necessarily great at. And it's good to know that, we're not the only ones who are oftentimes seeing 50% of our people leave the faith after they're leaving high school. So
yeah.
Looking forward to that. As we're looking at applying it in our context, how would you say that sticky faith applies back into the core of the gospel?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Dana, because it's really the most important starting point. We'll get to things that are more, quote, relational, end quote, and we'll get to practices that churches can use immediately and families can use immediately. But ultimately, if our understanding, or if young people's understanding of the gospel isn't right, then everything else we add to it is just building on a flawed foundation. So one of the really core findings for Sticky Faith is that young people really have a toxic view of the gospel. The young people that we studied, when we really peeled away what they thought the gospel was, it was more what Dallas Willard called the gospel of sin management. A gospel that's all about behaviors, and this idea that if we do all the right behaviors and avoid all the wrong behaviors, then somehow God likes us more, God loves us more, and we feel a little bit better about ourselves. And so, when young people, when a person of any age, but especially when young people distill the faith to a list of behaviors, then no wonder they don't want to stick with it. I wouldn't want to stick with that either. As I think about the gospel of sin management, I think about a young person that we'll call Rebecca. And I knew Rebecca well when she was in junior high. I was working with junior hires at the time. And so we were together with a bunch of girls in a cabin for a week at a summer camp. And she and I totally bonded. Then she went to high school and I stayed working with junior hires. So I'd see her around church, but not as much. Then she went to college and I very much lost touch with her. She contacted me not too long ago and said, hey, I'm interested in finding out more about Fuller. And so she and I met for coffee and we talked for about 20 minutes about Fuller's programs and youth, family, culture. And anybody who's watching this, Fuller has amazing academic programs, many of which can be done largely online. So you could study at Fuller. And this is what I was trying to communicate to Rebecca. And after about 20 minutes, I felt like I had answered her questions. And so I said, Rebecca, I want to know what happened to you after high school. I kind of lost touch with you. And all of a sudden, her whole demeanor changed. She had been giving me eye contact, but instead she looked down at her coffee cup and she said, oh, Kara, it was really, really hard. And I said, why? And she said, well, I started dating a non-Christian in college. I did missionary dating is what she called it. And I went further physically than I ever thought I would go. And I felt so badly about what I had done that I plunged into depression and developed an eating disorder. Mm. She's sitting across the table from me, and yeah, I mean, my heart is just breaking, thinking that she went through this, and I, as her leader, didn't even know she was going through it. And as hard as it was for me to hear what she had said up to that point, what she said next was even harder, because she said, in the midst of me feeling so bad about what I had done, the last place I felt like I could turn was the church for hope. The last place I felt like I could turn was to God for healing. And I thought, I failed Rebecca, because somehow she graduated from our ministry thinking that faith was behaviors, a list of do's and don'ts. And as long as we do the right behaviors and avoid the wrong behaviors, then somehow we're on God's good side. How did we see this in our research? At the end of students' third year in college, toward the very end of our study, we asked them, how would you describe the gospel? And, actually, the question, let me correct it. How would you describe being a Christian was actually the question. And we asked that question, and to be honest, I didn't really think we were going to learn much from it, but I thought, okay, we can go ahead and throw it in the instrument. I was really wrong, because 1 out of 3 of the young people who answered that question, as they described what it meant to be a Christian, they didn't mention Jesus in their answers. They mentioned love. That was the most dominant theme, is what does it mean to be a Christian? It means you love other people. Now, Jesus wants us to love other people, but anytime we truncate the faith to behaviors, even good behaviors like love, no wonder young people are running from it. And so out of our sticky faith research, we're just urging churches to make sure that they really are centering their teaching, their small groups, their discipleship, their counseling in grace. Grace is what separates Christianity from every other religion. And yet a lot of times this behavioralist mentality creeps into our mindset and creeps into our teaching. One of my colleagues here at Fuller, Dale Ryan, says, if you were to distill the sermons in the U.S. down to 2 words, you could say that many, arguably most, of the sermons in the U.S. on any given weekend boil down to this: try harder. Mm. And as young people hear that week after week, and then they fail, then no wonder they run from the church. And, as I think about Rebecca, she ran from the church and God himself just when she needed both God and the church the most. So out of sticky faith, I have made a commitment as a communicator that, I'm rigorous in making sure that my teaching is really marinating young people in grace. And even when I teach the imperatives of Scripture, because there are a lot of commands, there are a lot of do's and don'ts in Scripture. For me, it's all about the motivation, and the motivation needs to be God's grace. As we abide, fruit will come. As we rest in a sense of God's grace, we then serve out of a sense of God's gratitude.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And like you said, that's applicable to people of any age. And then maybe that perhaps because so many generations past have had that mindset, that and a good word for us, who are preaching to make sure that that's what we're connecting with.
Yeah, and we urge leaders to go back and do a bit of a post-mortem on their preaching, do a little bit of analysis and say, okay, as I look over the last 4 weeks, 6 weeks of any time that I've taught, whether it's sermons, whether it's Sunday school, whether it's small groups, whatever context it might be, how much have I talked about grace, and how much have I ended up talking about, kind of the gospel of sin management or the gospel of try harder?
Yeah. Good word. Well, if you're bringing it then into like the family and parenting level, how can sticky faith apply to parenting and just being a family in general?
Yeah, well, and that's one of the wonderful things about our research is we saw how important it is for churches and families to partner together. We're big fans here at the Fuller Youth Institute of Orange, a movement out of the Southeast led by Reggie Joyner that talks about how, the yellow, that's the light of Christ, needs to combine with the red, that's the heart of love. And when you bring together yellow and red, you get orange. The best research done by Fuller and others shows that as influential as the churches and as leaders are and as mentors are, really the parents are the number one faith formation influence on young people. Chris Smith, in his well-known study, the National Study of Youth and Religion, of over 2,000 young people from all different faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Mormonism, etc. As he looked at 2,000 young people, he came to the conclusion, and this is a quote that he said at a panel at Fuller Seminary here, that when it comes to kids' faith, parents get what they are. When it comes to kids' faith, we as parents get what we are. Now, of course, there's all sorts of exceptions to this, and I'm sure many of us watching this, we have different faith trajectories than our parents, or we've parented multiple children and they've taken different faith paths. So take this with a lot of grains of salt, but nonetheless, the best research shows it's just hard to point to any factor more determinative in a young person's faith development than the faith of their parents, which then causes us as leaders to think a few logical questions, right? How are we strengthening parents' faith? How are we really partnering with parents? So that they understand their role in their own children's faith formation, but then they also understand the church's role in faith formation. And just really practically, one of the ways that Sticky Faith has made such a difference in how I parent, and we urge churches to share this information with families, is it's really changed the way that I talk about my faith with my kids. So many parents did what I do before, or do what I did before Sticky Faith, which is, after church on a Sunday, on the drive home or over lunch, or as you pick up your kid from youth group, you ask them, well, how was church? How was youth group? What did you talk about? What did you study? And depending on your kid's mood or personality, you might get an answer. You might get kind of a leave me alone, mom, eye roll. And our research suggests it's a really good thing for parents to keep asking those questions. But what is as important and much less practiced is that parents share about their own faith journey also. It's not just interviewing our kids or lecturing our kids, but for us to share, here's what God is showing me. So, I like to pray and read the Bible in the mornings. I don't do it every morning, but I do like to do it when I can. And I sit on the navy blue couch in our living room. And before our Sticky Faith research, if my son Nathan would come in and say, Mom, where are my tennis shoes? And if I was praying or journaling, I would think, isn't it great that Nathan's seeing me praying and journaling right now? And that's still very true. But now when he comes in and he says, Mom, where are my tennis shoes? I'll say, hey, Nathan, do you want to see what I'm reading in the Psalms today? Can I show you the page in my prayer journal where I'm praying for you? Because I've prayed for my kids spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, and socially since they were really young. That's kind of, I like to pray holistically for my kids. But until Sticky Faith, I wasn't telling them what I was praying for them. So, we love saying to parents, our research isn't even necessarily saying you need to, quote, be more spiritual, end quote. Just start by sharing with your kids the spirituality that you already have. So even around the dinner table, it's changed the way that we interact. Since our kids were little, we've done highs and lows. And now, because of Sticky Faith and what we were just talking about with the gospel, we've added this question: what mistake did you make today? And I'll tell you, our 9-year-old, she loves keeping track of my mistakes. So she'll come she comes to dinner with like a whole list of mistakes mom's made throughout the day. But we also ask around the dinner table, how did you see God at work today? And when we first introduced that question, our then 9-year-old said, well, Mom, Dad, I can't answer that question. Really, why not? She said, well, I don't have a job. How did you see God at work today? But when we changed it to, how did you see God working today? Oh, okay, yeah, now she can answer it. And so, now around the dinner table, not every night, but a lot of nights, we talk about how we see God at work. And, sometimes my kids' answers are, we won the kickball tournament, or I didn't have much homework. And, I don't love the theology behind that. And we'll start deconstructing that as they get a little bit older. But I love that every night our kids are hearing Dave and me talk about how we saw God at work that day.
Yeah, we've started to incorporate that same question because of your book. And we used to do highs and lows before, but now though, where have you seen God working today?
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe 50% of the time it's, generic answers, but sometimes there's some really good insights and also helpful for us to ask the same question for ourselves, because we often don't ponder that question as well just by going through the routine of life.
Yeah. And, we love saying to parents, let's reclaim those cracks of time that we have with our kids. Every family that I know is just so busy. And so, in the spirit of Sticky Faith, we're not trying to give you 12 new things that are very time consuming to do every week. We're just saying, you know what, you're already probably eating at some point with your kid. Why don't you try talking to them about this? Or you're already driving them to soccer practice or hockey practice. Why don't you try talking to them about this? So, using that time around the table, that time in the car, especially when your kids are younger, that bedtime, whatever windows of time we have with our kids, just being a little bit more intentional and bringing God into our discussions a little bit more purposefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I will
And the
say
other
this,
thing,
one of the fascinating, and this isn't real solid data, but it's just intriguing to me. We have these sticky faith cohorts where churches walk through our research over the course of a year. And one of the leaders that was very intrigued by this idea of parents just talking about God around their kids went to 20 kids that were very churched. It was actually on a short-term mission trip over the summer. Went to 20 kids on a trip and asked, do you know how your parents became Christians? And 0 of the kids on that trip knew how their parents became Christians, which is just so eye-opening about how we as parents, we're not talking with our kids about our spirituality now or the journey that led us up to now. And, I share that story about 0 out of 20 in rooms with pastors, and pastors come up to me afterwards and parents come up to me afterwards and say, you know what, our kids don't know. And so, part of what we can do as leaders is just remind parents to share not only what God's doing now, but what God has done in the past and how meaningful that is to kids.
Yeah, I bet. You mentioned in talking previously about the surprise question of what people thought what a Christian was, and really what was lacking in that answer. What other surprises came out of your research?
Yeah. Well, a number of them, but let me just focus on one that I think is probably the biggest surprise for us. And that is the role of doubt in a young person's faith formation. We tend to think that doubt is bad, doubt is toxic. A young person who's asking questions, we really got to be concerned for them. And while at times that might be true, what we actually found is that when young people had the chance to express and explore their doubts in high school, that was actually correlated with greater faith maturity, both in high school and college. So putting it more simply, it's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence that is toxic to faith. And we can't fool ourselves. In our study, 70% of high school seniors had significant questions about God. And as I think about young people's questions about God, I think about a 12-year-old named Steve. And Steve was a precocious, curious, kind of squirrely junior higher. And he went to his senior pastor once, and he asked his senior pastor this question: Pastor, if I raise my pinky finger, does God know which finger I'm going to raise before I raise it? And the senior pastor said, yes, Steve, God knows what finger you're going to raise before you raise it. And Steve was very bothered by the starving children in Africa that bother all of us. And so he pulled out from behind his back a copy of a magazine that on the cover had pictures of starving kids in Africa. And he said, well, then, Pastor, does God know what's happening with these starving kids in Africa? And the well-intentioned pastor said, yes, Steve, God knows what's happening with these kids in Africa, and we just need to trust God. And that answer didn't satisfy Steve. It didn't give him an on-ramp for a deeper conversation. It was really a dead end instead. And so Steve walked out of that Christian church that day and never again went back to a Christian church for worship. As a junior higher, that answer just didn't satisfy him. Now, I haven't mentioned who Steve is, but I'm guessing all of us who are watching this today, participating together today, we actually know this Steve because it's Steve Jobs. And in the biography by Isaacson, he tells this story of junior high Steve Jobs, who had a really good, valid question about God and why God would allow suffering. And the pastor didn't know how to respond. Now, the pastor was well-intentioned, I'm sure. But if I had had a chance to talk to Steve, or if I had a chance to talk to that senior pastor, out of our research, we recommend we say 4 words to young people as they're wrestling with tough questions. And those 4 words are, I don't know, but. I would have loved for that pastor to say to Steve, Steve, that's such a good question. I don't totally know, but here's what I do know about God. Or Steve, I love that question and I don't really have a good answer, but I know a woman in our church who loves thinking about those kinds of things. What about if you, me, and your mom get together and go out to coffee with her and let's talk about it together? Or I don't know, but how about you and me? Let's meet again and let's process it and let's look at what scripture and others have had to say on this. But unfortunately, nobody said that to Steve. And so Steve became one of that 50% that drifts from God and from the church. So, Dana, you asked one of the biggest surprises, and it is that doubt isn't bad, but our response to doubt can be bad. And even just in my own family, as we've gone through the death of a close friend of mine through cancer, and it was just an agonizing series of months, and especially for my kids, seeing the mom of their friends going through this. When my dear friend Chrissy finally went to be with the Lord, our daughter Krista was just so mad, and she was stomping around her bedroom just in circles. And why would God allow this? Why would God allow this? And before Sticky Faith, I probably would have rushed in and tried to give some kind of pat answer. But because of Sticky Faith, I just sat on the edge of her twin bed and watched her as she stomped around. And eventually she came and sat down next to me, and I put my arm around her and I said, Krista, I don't totally know why God would allow this, but here's what I do know about God. So I've even seen in kind of the darkest of days with my family that Sticky Faith gives me some tools to know how to respond to my kids' really good, valid, legitimate questions.
Yeah. I wrote down that line that doubt isn't toxic, but silence is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You you mentioned in that story about perhaps if a pastor knew somebody else. One of the things I love seeing is how the whole church can be involved. And, I've seen so many churches change from just saying, I'm the children's director to, to students and their families and seeing it holistically, and then going even beyond that to how does the whole church participate in this? Can you talk a little bit more about what you have seen when it comes to, the whole church coming together?
Yeah. Well, in many ways, this is probably what Sticky Faith is best known for. While, you and I together today, we've already talked about a sticky gospel. We've talked about how to, build Sticky Faith families. We've talked about how doubt can actually help faith stick. But of all of our research, what most people know about Sticky Faith is our research related to how the whole church can be and should be involved in young people's faith formation. So what happened, Dana, is we looked at 13 different youth group participation variables, 13 things that kids tend to do in the context of a youth group. And, you and others on this webinar today, you'll be glad to know that being involved in service and justice work was correlated with mature faith. Being involved in student leadership, studying scripture, also correlated with mature faith. But of the 13 variables we looked at, the one that was most correlated with mature faith in both high school and college was intergenerational worship and relationships. In other words, bringing the generations together and not keeping young people, kind of off segmented on their own. Now, I'm certainly a fan of children's and student ministry. And, our junior high ministry is doing a 2-day service activity and this weekend called The Amazing Race, and they're spending the afternoon at our house. And I love that, our 7th grade daughter is going to be around a bunch of junior highers serving. And, our 4th grader is going to a movie night at our church on Friday nights for 4th and 5th graders. So, we love that our church offers age-specific opportunities for our kids. But one of my life mantras is that balance is something that we swing through on our way to the other extreme. And that's what's tend to happen in our churches, that in our effort to offer relevant, meaningful programs to young people, we've ended up segregating them from the rest of the church. And that verb segregation is not a verb I use lightly, but sadly, that's what's happened. And we end up with great children's ministry, our preschool ministry, children's ministry, student, young adults, emerging adults, women's, men's, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And we aren't experiencing what it means to be the overall diverse community of faith that God intends us to be. So what we hear from youth group graduates is they often have a really hard time finding a church when they graduate from high school. And we think part of that is because even in high school, they haven't known church. They've known youth group. They haven't known, say, their senior pastor and other adults in the church. They've known their youth pastor and their small group leader. So many churches are looking at Sticky Faith, including churches that are part of ECO, and saying, how do we bring about a more intergenerational culture? And a great way to operationalize that is to build on a fantastic suggestion from my friend and colleague, Chap Clark, here at Fuller. And Chap says a lot of brilliant things, but I think the most brilliant thing he said in the last few years is that we need a new 5-to-1 ratio. Now, what do we mean by that? My hunch is if I was to show up at any eco church, say this coming weekend, you'd probably have some sort of hope for a leader to student ratio. You know, you've got small groups, you've got Sunday school classes, whatever it might be, and let's just say you want one adult for every 5 kids. Well, what we're saying out of our research is it's not about one adult for every 5 kids. Let's reverse that and let's have 5 adults investing in each student. 5 adults who know those students and are supporting those students and praying for those students. And even as I say that, you know, I don't want people who are part of this webinar participating with us today to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm having a hard enough time recruiting one leader for 5 kids, and now I'm supposed to recruit 5 leaders for each kid. No, 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 no. We're not talking about 5 small group leaders. We're not talking about 5 Sunday school teachers. We're talking about 5 adults who are, as we say in our family, who are on that kid's team, who are praying for that kid, who show up for a special Boy Scout event, who show up for a special play, who show up for a volleyball tournament or championship. You know, those kind of adults who really rally around that young person so that they feel known and supported and cared for. So it's been so encouraging to see congregations move toward this kind of intergenerational climate in a variety of ways. Some churches are being kind of radical, and they're tweaking or maybe even substantively changing their weekend worship services. So, you know, some churches are saying once a month, we want the young people to come in, or, you know, the first 15 minutes of every Sunday morning worship service, we want the children and young people to come in, and then they're dismissed to their classes. Other churches are being even more radical and saying, you know, Sunday mornings, we're not going to offer, say, high school or middle school programming because we really want the teenagers in our midst. My church, it's a fairly large church, and so our rhythm is about every 2 months we have an intergenerational worship where we, you know, kindergarten through 12th, it's all in the overall worship experience that the congregation has. So, you know, we urge congregations to figure out what rhythms make the most sense for them, but to think about, are our children and our students really feeling like they're part of our congregation, or do they feel like they're almost a separate church in some ways? Yeah. And then many churches are also making great progress through intergenerational service. A lot of times adults want to talk, even adults who want to talk to teenagers don't know how to do it. And there's something about service that it's kind of low-hanging fruit. So for leaders who are wondering, where do I start in building intergenerational relationships? Often service is a great first step, because, you know, for that adult who wants to talk to a kid, but the idea of going out to coffee or whatever just seems intimidating, it's much easier if they're painting a local public school together, or if they're sitting with somebody who's homeless, sharing a sandwich together. Those kinds of intergenerational connections often really are catalysts for bringing the generations together.
Yeah, that's I know I've seen that as well. Those service projects are a great way to move forward, and we had fun helping to develop who's the 5 adults on our kids team.
Yeah.
And really asking them, you know, who do they admire and look up to who are adults other than us? And it was great, and saying how can they be more intentional.
Yeah. Yeah. And for kids your age, Dana, I mean, when our kids were younger, like those adults, those were often our babysitters, because, you know, if our kids wanted to get to know an adult better and any of those adults happened to babysit, well, that was called killing 2 birds in 1 stone.
Absolutely.
Not that I'm for bird killing, but you know what I mean. And you know, we're finding as our kids are getting older that we're looking for ways to really celebrate those 5 adults. So when Nathan turned 13 and 2 years ago, and Krista just turned 13 last week, and with both of them, you know, I'll just walk through the process with Nathan. So, you know, we sat with Nathan and said, who are 5 adults that you want to get to know better? And he named the 5 we thought he would. And so the summer before he turned 13, we asked those 5 men, would you spend some time with Nathan? And they ranged in age from, I think, 38 to 72. One of them was 72 years old. And, you know, each of those 5 men, they took him out for golf or hiking or, you know, whatever, something convenient in their schedule, shared life advice and spiritual advice with Nathan. And, you know, those 5 men are very significant to Nathan now, and they feel like his team. And we just did the same thing with Krista. She just had her 5th time with her 5th female adult person on her team just this past Saturday. So yeah, we're really trying as parents to make this vivid for our kids, that these are the adults that you can go to when you don't feel like you can go to us. They are a safety net for you. They are support for you.
Yeah. Great. I have a couple more questions for you, but I also want to remind our audience to if you do want to email questions about this, we have a couple more questions formally, and then and that is bnelson, NELSON @fuller.edu. You talked about some churches that make radical shifts, and I know of one that has done that as a result of being part of the cohort that you all offer, and it's made some significant changes, and just love it. Tell me a little bit about some of the resources that you all offer. What are some next steps that churches can take? And I want to be able to say openly too, one of the reasons that we have you and our other speakers coming is that so often conferences can be an encouragement, but they can let us know what's going wrong, but not a lot of solutions going forward. So part of the reason we asked you to speak is because you do have wonderful next steps that churches can take to help move things forward.
Great. Well, thanks for asking that, Dana. And we love partnering with you and are eager for the January conference. I would say the first step is to go to our website, and stickyfaith.org. It has hundreds of resources, the majority of which are free. So you can go to stickyfaith.org. We even have a whole portal for parents. So as you as a leader want to help parents, you can get some great ideas for them and that they can use. And then we have a whole portal for leaders, and all of that is available at stickyfaith.org. We also have the book that you mentioned that your family is using, the Sticky Faith Guide for Your Family. That's available through stickyfaith.org or Amazon. For folks who want to provide more training for parents, we have a brand new 5-session video series called Sticky Faith Family Training that I'm just so excited about it. And it's been a joy to hear churches using it with parent Sunday school classes, with parent training, with small groups that happen to be comprised of parents, and just seeing parents starting to have really important conversations. So the website, the Sticky Faith Guide for Your Family book, Sticky Faith Family Training. And then for churches who want the fullest exposure to our Sticky Faith research, we have a year-long cohort, and one is starting in January 2016. So this is the perfect time for churches to be thinking and praying, do I want to be part of a year-long process to really immerse myself and our team in this cohort experience here at the Fuller Youth Institute?
Yeah. And I know several of our churches have done that with the, with the cohort, and have had a great experience through it. Tell us a little bit more about the cohort. And when you say it starts in January, what does that look like? What do churches experience?
Yeah. Well, and actually, as I'm thinking about it, we started the cohort because of a church that is now part of ECO. I hadn't put all this together until just now, but like in maybe 2010, this particular church heard about our research and said, gosh, this is just so much good information, too much for me to absorb in a day. I really need longer to process. And so we thought, well, what if we brought churches together and so churches could learn from us and from each other. And that was really the birth of the cohort. So it is a 12-month process from January to December. Teams, and this is part of what I love about the cohort, is that teams come to 2 summits that we have, one in February and one in October, both of which are pretty good times to come here to sunny Southern California. So a church would bring at least 2 people, but we had the summit last week, and there were churches that were bringing 5 or 6 people. So whatever your budget and dynamics allow. But teams come for these 2 summits in February and October, and then we offer monthly webinars just like this, Dana, for churches to continue to process our research. We spent a lot of time on what needs to change, as we kind of have today. But to be honest, we spend almost as much time as how do you bring about change? And I think that's actually a tougher question. How do you change a church culture? As somebody said last week in our summit, how do you, when there's new wine and old wineskins, what do you do about that as a leader? And we have some amazing faculty members here at Fuller who are like gurus on organizational change. So cohort churches spend a lot of time with them. Throughout the course of a year, you also get personalized coaching. You'll work on your own breakthrough plan. I mean, 80% of churches who've been through our Sticky Faith cohort say it's the best training they've ever received. So, and I have great news for eco churches. For a non-eco church that signs up now, the cost is $4,000. For an eco church, we're able to give a $500 discount. So the total cost would be $3,500. And I realize that's a major investment. What most churches do is that just Sticky Faith cohort just becomes their training budget for the year. But since children and youth and so many people from your church are part of it, it actually brings your church together in a great cohesive way. So for churches who are interested in finding out more, you can go to stickyfaith.org, or the email address that we've been giving during this webinar, bnelson@fuller.edu. He's really in charge of our Sticky Faith cohort, so you can ask him any questions that you want.
Great. You know, we're going to be you know, moving forward at some point, you know, even with church plants, and we have some church plants going forward, and thinking that how difficult it is to change a culture, to if they can also begin doing this and starting well in it.
Yeah. So. Yeah, for church plants, I mean, there's certainly other challenges for church plants, but you know, at least you can start a culture instead of changing a culture. So it is a tiny bit easier on that level. So,
on that level, yeah. Right. It's one of the things, yeah. Well, I know hopefully some questions have been coming in to Brian, and so I'll go ahead and let you think he's sorted those out, and you answer some of those.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm getting a great question right here. Somebody's asking, Sean is asking, how can we show parents that research is actually meaningful to them? And how can we expect parents to pass on Sticky Faith to their kids when they don't have it themselves because they are products of the traditional youth ministry model that we are trying to change? Wow, what a great question. Let me break that up into two pieces. The first of which is, you know, what do we do about the fact that we are products of the traditional youth ministry model that it needs to be changed? One of the big insights that we talk about in the Sticky Faith cohort experience is that people don't resist change, they resist loss. Most of us, it's not change per se that makes us nervous, it's the loss associated with that change. So that is a big principle. A second principle that we highlight so much in our Sticky Faith cohorts is that leadership begins with listening. Leadership begins with listening. So if I was in that kind of setting where there were a lot of adults who were products of a traditional youth ministry model, and we're saying, okay, now we need to change some of that, what I would want to do is I would want to spend time with them to listen, to figure out what is it that they are afraid of losing. Is it this picture that they had in their mind that, you know, just like what happened to them as a 16-year-old, the same thing's going to happen to their 16-year-old child? Is it something even more deep, that, you know, if I'm a product of a particular way of doing ministry, and now we're saying that that way of doing ministry isn't the best way, that can bring up some kind of existential questions about my own faith. So, you know, we just urge leaders, and it's hard because we're busy, et cetera, and we often have a plan in our head, but it's, I was going to say always, I think I'm going to say always. I was wondering if I should say almost always or always. See, I'm an academic, so we qualify everything, but it's really always better to take the time to listen to people, understand what they're afraid of losing, and then show how this new way of doing ministry can compensate for some of those losses. So that's what I would say, is that it's a lot of listening and a lot of sensitivity to the loss. Now, a corollary question that we get sometimes from folks is, you know, especially when it comes to intergenerational ministry, is, well, what do I do if I don't want the kids in our youth group to have the faith of the adults in our church? And in all candor, we've heard that from more youth leaders than I can count. They love their kids, but they look around at the adult landscape at their church and go, this is not, I don't think this is what I want my students to grow into. Well, usually what I say at that point is, I don't know if you remember the children's game Red Rover. And I used to play it a lot. I was never very good at it, but I used to play it a lot. And, you know, the essence of that game is you look around and you're very intentional. You're, okay, Red Rover, send Dana right over, or Red Rover, send Juanita right over. And you are picking the people that you want on your team. And so for those of us who are in settings where, you know, we look around our church and go, the adult culture here is not one that I want to infiltrate our kids. I would bet a lot of money, if I was a betting person, that there are adults in your church that you do love how they pursue Jesus and invite others to do likewise. And so at that point, we just have to be more intentional and say, who would we most want our kids to emulate, and really invite them explicitly, verbally, to be involved in the youth ministry, to be on young people's team, to be part of that 5-person web that supports young people. So Sean, fantastic question, and you really went for the belly of the beast there. So thank you for helping us raise that really good and important and honest question about kind of the discrepancies in some of our churches, and what do we do about that. So what would be a next good question? Okay, what do you do when kids begin not to go to big church? We currently do once a month worship together, and we lost about 1/3 of our kids on those Sundays. This is a question from Rob. Great question. What do you do when kids begin to not go to big church? We currently do once a month worship together, and we lost about 1/3 of our kids on those Sundays. I remember I was speaking at a church and did a seminar on intergenerational and sticky faith, and parents were there, and it happened to be an intergenerational worship Sunday, and so there was a worship service right after I did the seminar on sticky faith and intergenerational relationships. I swung by a grocery store as I was leaving the church, and I saw a number of church families like in that grocery store doing shopping because they were choosing not to go to intergenerational because it was an intergenerational Sunday, and their kids didn't really want to go. So Rob, what you're experiencing happens in other churches. A couple thoughts come to mind. Number one, sometimes kids, they just need an opportunity to really be involved in the overall life of the church. So many times young people feel like spectators instead of creators. And one of my big leadership change principles is that people tend to support what they create. Or we just heard Patrick Lencioni on a video last week say, if there's no way in, there's no buy-in. So, what I would say to those young people who feel like it's boring or don't want to come or whatever it might be, I try to figure out, is there a way that they can be involved in making it more lively? What would it look like for them to help do with certain aspects of the planning, or even be involved in some of the worship elements itself, or perhaps be involved in children's ministry during that time, or tech ministry, or whatever, greeting ministry, or whatever it might be. So, I would look at those young people who are least likely to come and see, is there a way that involving them in leadership and service would strengthen a connection? A second thing I would say is I would look long and hard at the worship service and say, are there elements of our worship service that we need to rethink when it comes to our intergenerational weekends, such as sermon length, such as music, and be willing. That's one of the questions that churches have to ask is, what are we willing to change so that young people feel more comfortable? And just one quick story. One of the youth pastors that was in our Sticky Faith cohort, he had this worship CD that was in his car, and there was one song that he just didn't like, and it was track 11. And every time the CD got to track 11, he would just hit the button to advance past it. He just didn't like the song, didn't like the lyrics, didn't like the melody. Well, one day he had his 5-year-old in the back seat, and apparently when the 5-year-old's mom, the wife of this youth leader, drives, she loves track 11, so she listens to it just like she listens to the rest of the songs. So the 5-year-old hears track 11 a lot. And so one time as he was driving, he didn't quite hit the button fast enough, and so track 11 comes on, and from the back seat, the 5-year-old just starts singing, and it's clear that the 5-year-old loves track 11. And my friend, the youth pastor who was driving, he all of a sudden he realized, gosh, my 5-year-old loves track 11. Maybe it's time that I give track 11 more of a chance. And now track 11 is his favorite song because of what it means to the 5-year-old. And I think that's the question all of us have to ask, whether we're 18 or 48 or 78. What's going to be that track 11 change that we're willing to make? What are we willing to do a little bit less of or a little bit more of in order to help young people feel welcome and really feel a part of our church? So, Rob, that's a fantastic question, and one that many churches are dealing with. Somebody wrote in from Bob from Arizona. Kara, I have grandsons in college, but I don't hear about Christian student centers. Could you speak some on the Christian resources that are available to college students? Great question. There are some amazing, amazing parachurch ministries available for college students. Things like Navigators, InterVarsity, Campus Crusade, which is now called Crew. So I know those are available. And, Dana, my hunch is you know a little bit more about ECO or maybe Presbyterian resources that are available to college students. Any thoughts about that? And then I'll add to it after you share anything particularly relevant to your movement and denomination.
Well, and I think oftentimes for us, we don't want to be creating a lot of new stuff. And so a lot of times what we're encouraging people to do is to say, partner with your local InterVarsity or something like that to be able to have a symbiotic relationship together.
That's great. That's great. And the good news is that, thanks to the internet, you can look up all the campus ministries that are available for particular college students. And out of Sticky Faith, one of the encouragements that we give to families is as you're doing college tours, like make sure you check out faith community elements too. I was just talking to a good friend who, took her daughter to visit college, her daughter who's a high school senior. And, their whole schedule revolved around the sport that the daughter was in. And my friend said, yeah, unfortunately, we didn't get to go to a church or a campus ministry. And I was just like, oh, no, because that's such an important part of the formula of what a school is going to mean for a young person. So one of the things we say to parents and families of high school seniors is as much as possible, do your homework online, on the phone, talking to local pastors, talking to campus ministry leaders, and if possible, visiting in person. So great question. I will say this, that if you're looking for more resources on college ministry, Chuck Bomar, Bomar, he has a website. I don't know the exact website, but if you Google Chuck Bomar and college students, we often point people to his work on college age people, and it's really, really solid. So here's another question. This may be our last one. Our church is going through a lot of transitions. How do you know if it's at the right time to go through the training of the cohort? Wonderful question. I would say probably 10 to 20% of the churches that are in the cohort this year are going through transition. They just lost their senior pastor, their senior pastor's coming, etc. And actually what's great about Sticky Faith is it brings a sense of cohesion to a church that's going through transition. So, if your senior pastor's just left and Sticky Faith feels like the right path to walk down, then how wonderful for you to walk down that path now so that you have some momentum as you gain a new pastoral leader. And the same is true if you have a new student ministry person or a new family ministry person or children's ministry, whatever it might be. If Sticky Faith feels like the right direction to go, then set them up to succeed by already walking down the Sticky Faith path now. So yeah, we've had great success with churches in transition who usually end up saying, I'm so glad that I was in the cohort because Sticky Faith gave us the framework we needed to stay connected and continue to have momentum. So wonderful question. Thank you very much. Any other questions, or are we ready to go? Dana, maybe do you have one last question that we could wrap up with based on what you know about your churches or your experience as a parent or anything else that you're wondering about when it comes to building long-term faith in young people?
Yeah, I think that, the thing that is what I love what I'm hearing you say about, this team of 5 and connecting them intergenerationally and the whole track 11. I was trying to, connect some dots there. And I think what my experience is when older people are connected with students and youth, then I think a lot of times then when you have to make those changes in your church, they're connected personally rather than just it's a change that's coming. There's something to be gained as, hey, this is important to this student that I've connected with. So yeah. I think that's an easy way to then begin the larger transformations that might need to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. So one last quick story. I was my son, who just started high school, as I mentioned, he had his first dance about 3 weeks ago. And it was a Friday night, and I was speaking at a mother-daughter retreat here in Southern California, about an hour from my house. So I had my 2 daughters in the van, and I didn't get to see my son after school because we had to leave before he got out of school. So I thought, as I'm driving up the mountain, I thought, I'm going to call Nathan and just talk to him a little bit about the dance and see how he's doing. So I called him, and he said, And you know, I said, so what are you wearing? And he told me what he was wearing. And I said, so do you think you're going to ask any girls to dance? And he's like, oh, I don't know. I very helpfully started giving him suggestions of girls he could maybe ask to dance. And I could tell my suggestions were really not connecting with him. And so I said, you know, Nathan, maybe it's sounding like you don't want to talk anymore about this. And he said, well, you know, Mom, I don't really want to talk about the dance with my 48-year-old mom. And I said, well, Nathan, first off, I'm 45. And so we've had a good laugh about that over the last few weeks, that he doesn't know my age. And then I said, and it's totally fine that you don't want to talk to me about this today. And I didn't say this aloud to him, but what I thought in my mind is, I'm so glad that he has other adults to talk to about this. And, you know, a week later, he was open to talking to me about something going on with girls. And the week before, he was open to talking to me about something going on with girls. But there are those times, especially when our teenage children don't want to talk to us as parents. And so that's where it's so wonderful to be the community that God intends us to be. And what's fantastic, Dana, is while we've really looked at what's good for young people in this webinar, what we've found as we've walked with eco churches and other churches is that when adults invest in young people, the adults are transformed too. So, I mean, it's the wonderful sticky faith repercussions, is it deepens the faith of young people, and then it brings vitality to the overall church. So we would love to stay in touch with eco churches. They can email Brian Nelson at bnelson@fuller.edu and check out our resources on stickyfaith.org.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking this time, and for the churches you've worked with in the past, and for coming to the national gathering, and just this continued partnership that we're really looking forward to.
Oh, you bet. My pleasure. Blessings, everyone. Have a great day.